Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Canada's moral values have changed drastically over the last number of decades. Question is, why and how? And is there anything we can do about it? We want to talk about that today with our guest, Jonathon Van Maren, who joins us from Ontario today. He's the host of the Bridgehead podcast. He's an author, a newspaper columnist, an international speaker, an activist, and communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. That's a pro-life group in Canada. And his latest book is called How We Got Here, subtitle, A Guide to Our Anti-Christian Culture. That's available at thebridgehead.ca. Good to have you with us, Jonathon.
Great to be with you.
Lots to talk about today. By the way, so of course you sent me a digital copy to peruse to get some questions ready for the show today. I said, you know what, I've got to go and buy this, so I ordered the book. So I'm just going to tell our viewers right now, this book is worth ordering. Get it. Share it with your friends. It's something I think that's very, very important for us. So good job on this. It's just a wealth of knowledge, very well researched. So first of all, how we got here. Where is here? Where are we at right now?
It's a great question. So the title of the book came from a question I get asked at presentations all of the time, because I think that anybody today reading the newspaper, scrolling through their news feeds, understands that the country, the civilization that we currently live in is nothing like the one that even existed a couple of decades ago, right? When my mom went to public high school in Canada during her early years, they opened the day with the Lord's Prayer. Now it's more controversial for a Catholic school not to fly a LGBT flag than it is for them to actually fly one. And so everybody is kind of over the last several years really woken up to the fact that they don't recognize the country that they live in and that things have changed. And one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was to kind of put a you are here marker on the cultural map, because I think we need to understand how we got to this point. We need there to be a story that helps us to understand how we got from a country founded in Judeo-Christian values to the country that we live in now, which is incredibly anti-Christian in many ways, where Christian values are routinely condemned and mocked by Canada's top leaders. And to do that, people need to have a sense of what was the narrative, what was the chronology, what were the events that took place that took us from the country that my mother was born into to the one that I was born into in 1988, then to the country that my children have been born into over the past 7 years. And so I want Christians to understand how we got here so that they're empowered to recognize that it wasn't inevitable that these things would happen, and that there are things that we can do to push back against the things that are taking place.
Yeah, and we do need to push back. We'll talk more about that in the program here as well. But now you start your book off here with the sexual revolution, and people might complain, all you guys ever talk about is sexual issues. Well, it's funny how you look around the world today. Who's pressing that? Who's pushing that agenda, right? Man, it's all over the place. And of course, it impacts our family unit, our children, and so forth. But talk to us a little bit about the sexual revolution and where that started.
Well, that's a great point that you make there, because one of the things that's been frustrating, I think, for Canadian Christians is that when we notice that things are changing all around us, when we notice that things are happening that have never happened before, and when we notice those things out loud, we are told that all you ever want to talk about is these sexual issues. All you ever want to talk about is the changes kind of going on. And you're almost kind of gaslit into thinking that you're the one creating the culture war simply by noticing that the country that you live in is changing all around you. And the reason it's so important to understand the sexual revolution is because it is the most historically significant event of the past, I would easily say 100 years, but probably far more than that, because the sexual revolution utterly transformed the country. And to kind of break it down in a way that's easy for people to understand, and I do this in the book. In the book, I walk methodically through the various intellectuals and the various activists and the various leaders who started influencing things in the universities, then influencing things in politics, and then the riots and the protests in 1968, which eventually seeded the culture and began to shift it, and the various ways the message of the sexual revolution trickled into the culture through the entertainment industry, through the universities, and then eventually, of course, in all of the public high schools. what we've seen is a shift from a country rooted in scriptural values, the values of God's word, into a country rooted in the values of sexual revolution. And all of these little individual culture wars that we see taking place are actually just the conflicts that erupt when you see a nation and a civilization replace one value system with another value system. And so in Canada, I'm not going to get into the, 25 pages worth of details on which specific intellectuals led us in this direction. But for the purposes of a shorter interview, I think it would be helpful for Canadians to understand that here, this largely took place between the two Trudeaus. So the sexual revolution in a political way was inaugurated by Trudeau the Elder, the first Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, with the 1969 Omnibus Bill, which decriminalized abortion, decriminalized a wide range of sexual behaviors, made divorce much easier to get. And this agenda was pushed by him throughout his years in power. And then, of course, his son, Justin Trudeau, who is still the prime minister for a little bit longer, over the last decade has pushed this as far as he possibly can. And Justin Trudeau has actually been a very transformational figure in ways that I'm not even sure he completely understands. Because he's the one who's kind of blown up the common sense consensus in Canada, even on these social issues. And so Canada, between the two Trudeaus, is a much different country than it was prior to the two Trudeaus.
Yeah, it certainly has changed a lot. I mean, there were some guardrails there before on moral behavior, and some of those were removed by actually both Trudeaus, right? I mean, we can talk about, assisted suicide and so forth and where that trail is going, but not sure if we'll have time for that today or not. But the sexual revolution, man, it was such a shift, I think, from more of a, well, can I say a community, looking out for one another, the common good of society, as opposed to me. It's very self-centered. I want freedom. I want to do whatever I want to do without any consequences. It's just, hey, I love whoever I want, and part of that, I mean, you talk about it actually in the book as well. We don't often hear anyone talk about this, but birth control, specifically the pill, had a significant part to play in the sexual revolution and where we are today.
Yes, so that's a really interesting point because the sexual revolution, a lot of historians will say, look, there's other periods in Western history where you see a libertinism grip the culture for a little while. But the reason that this sexual revolution was so successful, the sexual revolution that lasted from the 1960s to the 1980s, and of course is ongoing today in different forms, is because technology met the moment. Because the birth control pill gave people this illusion that they could have sex without consequences and that we could split human intimacy from procreation. And of course, this didn't work. The birth control pill has a very high fail rate. Contraception has a very high fail rate. Condoms have a 13% fail rate. And so what you saw is first this idea that we could actually engage in sexual libertinism and there would be no consequences. Natural law would no longer apply because we had the technology to live as individuals as opposed to members of community where our individual behavior affected everybody. And of course, in each and every country where contraceptive use and birth control use became mainstream, we saw abortion get legalized a short time later. And the reason for that, of course, is because there is no magic pill or magic bit of latex that can avoid procreation, at least not all the time. And when people believe they can engage in intimacy without consequences, the rates of this behavior rises, meaning that the fail rates rise. And that's led to 4 million preborn children being destroyed by abortion in Canada since 1969, over 60 million children in the United States being destroyed by abortion since 1973. And it's important to note that you mentioned the sort of the me attitude, that I can do what I want rather than functioning as a member of a family and functioning as a member of a community. And it's really important to highlight the fact that this was done very deliberately, that the intellectuals of the sexual revolution believed that in order for a revolutionary society to be successful, you had to break up these institutions that people had fundamental loyalties to. So the term sexual revolution was coined by an intellectual named Wilhelm Reich, who actually said that the breakup of the family was necessary to create a society full of atomized individuals, and that the sexualization of childhood would need to be accomplished in order for the revolution to succeed. that was a view not pushed just by him, but also pushed by very significant figures like Michel Foucault, who turns out was a sexual predator himself, we found out several years ago. People like Margaret Mead, people like Alfred Kinsey, people who are now considered to be heroes in the secular pantheon of people who have shaped our culture. And one thing that I think the audience needs to understand is very often the historical narrative that we are taught in universities or in schools is that first we had the sexual revolution, and then as a result of the first we had secularization, we had Darwinism's scriptural criticism, and as people moved away from Christianity, they recognized they no longer had these moral prohibitions they had to listen to, and the sexual revolution was the result of secularization. But Mary Eberstadt, in her book, How the West Really Lost God, lays out the case that it was actually the reverse. The sexual revolution occurred, and the sexual revolution destroyed the natural communities in which faith flourishes. Most people are Christian not because they're suddenly convinced of the existence of God, but because they're born into Christian families, and faith is passed on from one generation to the next. And so when the sexual revolution blew apart these human ecosystems, we actually saw secularization rush in. And so when we talk about living in a post-Christian society or an anti-Christian society, we're actually talking about a society that was shaped by the sexual revolution. We did not become sexually libertarian because of secularization. We became secular. We became post-Christian because of the sexual revolution.
That's very interesting to ponder. Okay. And yeah, I mean, you look back to the 1960s, there was just a shift to secularization, like you say, following that sexual revolution. And you see prayer being removed from, schools and so forth, and laws changing, and less people attending church. I mean, one question we can ask is, why isn't our faith being passed on to the next generation so easily? Like you say, we were born into it, maybe. Any thoughts on how we can change that so we actually do successfully pass on our faith to the next generation?
Well, when it comes to the current era, I spent several chapters grappling with that question because for years we heard kind of snide comments from Christian thinkers saying, you know what, Christians are the only people having kids. And that means that eventually religion will win out because religious people are building families and secular people largely aren't. We're seeing a demographic crisis in every single developed country and some undeveloped countries as well. Canada's birth rate is far below the replacement rate. Newspapers like the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, even CTV will say Canada right now is experiencing a baby bust. People are choosing not to have children. But the reality is that there's two ways you can grow your worldview. One of those ways is by having children and passing those values on. And the other way is via recruitment. And that is why we see public schools being such a key battleground for sexual revolutionaries, is because they understand that state institutions exist to inculcate people with the state dogma. And the state dogmas are now the dogmas of the sexual revolution. It's why in Canada we have dozens of different days dedicated to celebrating various sexual identities. It's why we no longer just have Pride Month in June. We actually have, according to the Liberal government, Pride season, which is June, July, August, and September. It is now 4 months. How do you build an empire? You occupy time and space. And that is what the sexual revolutionaries have done in Canada as well. And so if we are to pass our values on to our children, there are some things that we cannot avoid doing. One of them is if we send our children to public schools, they will be taught the values of the state. And those values are sexual revolutionary values. And so whether you choose a private school, a Christian school, homeschooling, regardless of the level of sacrifice that it takes, we must do everything that we can to ensure that we are the ones educating our children, or that people we trust are educating our children. Otherwise, they will receive the values that our prime minister advocates for, that our government advocates for. Second, we have to prepare them for university, because in university, they will be receiving an education in which they will be taught that the sexual revolution was a good thing, that it was a positive thing. Our historical story will be rewritten. And in that historical story, Christians are villains and bigots, and Canada had to move past them in order to become the country that we were meant to become. And then we have to be incredibly discerning when it comes to the new digital age. And the new digital age, I think, caught most people by surprise, but the rates of pornography addiction in Christian communities are slowly but surely creeping up to the level that we see in secular communities. I speak on pornography in Christian high schools. I've spoken to about 3,000 students in the last 2 years. And in almost every class, we see kids being exposed to porn younger, and younger. Age 9 is now the average. And when kids have access to the internet, it means the pornographers have access to them. And when they have access to the internet, it means that they will be subject to what they call influencers, who, as the name indicates, actually do have an influence. And I was speaking at a Christian school in Alberta a while ago, where a third of the high school thought that it was rude not to use a trans-identifying person's preferred pronouns, as in referring to a male identifying as a woman, as a woman. And some of the teachers were kind of looking at each other stunned. How did this happen? The reality is that if we give them a device like this and they have access to these influencers, we are no longer able to pass our values down uninterrupted, and we no longer have the ability to contextualize the secular culture through the lens of scriptural truth, which previous generations had the opportunity to do. And so the internet has invaded all of our homes and has given this anti-Christian culture, in many cases and in many homes, direct access to the next generation. If we do not moderate that or cut that off, we will continue to see enormous numbers of young people leave the church.
That's very, very interesting. Yeah, we do need to take authority, I think, as parents over what is happening in our homes. Pornography, people may ask, well, what's so bad about it? Is it really that bad, right? And it is. It influences us in such a way that if you're hooked on pornography, and going back, many years I was, and I looking back, I go, man, you know what? It's horrible. It changes the way you view, in my case, women, right? And you go like, there's something wrong with that. That's not how the Lord views, his creation. That's somebody's daughter, And so our mind changes, and apparently even our physical brain, once we get addicted to this, is actually physically changed. And the way we view our society, the way we view our fellow human beings changes in a negative way. And these days, more and more, we're seeing pornography becoming violent in nature. That is a serious concern, isn't it?
So I have a whole chapter committed to the dangers of pornography, in which I touch on many of the things that you just said. But what I want to emphasize to people who are listening is that pornography today is not what pornography was, when Hugh Hefner was pushing Playboy or Larry Flint was pushing Hustler. It's not just pictures. It's far more addictive because there's far more content. I did a presentation at Carleton University almost 10 years ago now, in which I made the case that pornography is creating a rape culture, that it is wiring the libidos of a generation to sexual violence, which is mainstream now across all major pornography platforms. And at the time, a lot of people made fun of me. That is now the standard view, even amongst secular governments. And so Justin Trudeau, for example, once mused that pornography was probably driving part of the sexual violence crisis. We saw the government of the UK recognize that pornography is driving sexual violence amongst the young, and is seeking to figure out ways to prevent young people from accessing it. We've seen over half a dozen American states take legislative action to prevent pornography from being seen by the young. You have the Attorney General of France, who, after reviewing mainstream porn content, actually stated that pornographers should be prosecuted for hate crimes against women and for driving up rates of sexual violence. And so the Christian answer to why is pornography wrong is very, very simple. It's a violation of the seventh commandment. It's objectifying people. People are not objects. They are human beings created in the image of God. But the secular answer to why pornography is wrong is that it fundamentally rewires our brain, which Dr. Norman Doidge details in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, and which I detail in my own book, How We Got Here. And it grooms us to see sexual violence as a natural part of intimacy. And this has changed the sexual economy of every major Western country over the past 15 years, especially since the advent of the smartphone. And we now see secular psychiatrists, secular politicians, secular activists raising the alarm on this. Just to cite one example, I note in my book, when Nepal legalized porn, they saw a 300% jump in the rape rate, and they have since banned pornography again, recognizing that when you put pornography into a culture, it transforms the culture and it remakes society in the image of the pornographers. And for Christians who are listening and thinking, not my community, I've spoken in many of your communities, and I can promise you that this is absolutely taking place in our churches as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the surveys on it. There's certainly even a significant percentage of our pastors who, have become hooked on this as well. So it knows no limits in that sense. So we need a revival within our church as well to get right with the Lord and say, God, we need you desperately. And you know what? God likes to hear those prayers, and I think he likes to answer them. So we need to take that seriously and go to the Lord with that. Well, very, very briefly, I know I saw this on an interview. Somebody was talking to you about this, how porn is even connected to transgenderism. So we have this violence against women, and so now girls growing up seeing this. So there's this huge percentage of the transgender movement. They want to become. It's actually more so that the girls want to become guys. Well, why is that? And I think you're suggesting that because of the porn and the violence there's this. I don't want to be treated that way. I'd rather be a male or somewhere in between, non-binary.
So pornography is a fundamental driver of the entire transgender movement on all fronts. And so first, to your point, Matt Walsh did this brilliant documentary called What is a Woman, where he kind of boiled down the entire premises of gender ideology to, can you tell me what a woman is, what a man is? And it was a brilliant way to put it. But there's another way to answer that question. And as you pointed out, for young girls growing up today, what is a woman is being defined by sites like Pornhub. And what is taking place on Pornhub is that women are violated, they are degraded, they are abused, they are called horrifying names, they are maltreated. And this kind of behavior is now practiced as a matter of course amongst the younger generation in high schools. Just to give you an idea of how true this is and how difficult it is to exaggerate this, 24% of college-age women say they've been spontaneously choked during intimacy in the last 6 months. And there's similar data now from both Canada and the UK. There are practices that I hadn't even heard of when I started researching pornography that are now mainstream among young people. We're watching our sexual economy break down in real time. And there are a lot of young girls who look at that culture's answer to the question, what is a woman? And saying, if that's what being a woman is, then I want no part of that at all.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because what we're seeing is an increasing percentage of young women identifying not necessarily as male, but just as sort of non-binary or they, them.
Yeah.
It means they don't necessarily think that they're the opposite sex, but they just do not want to identify as women because they see that as placing a target on their back. And when I wrote my first column on this for the European Conservative, I got an unbelievable volume of responses from parents who said, this is what happened to my daughter, from girls themselves who said, this is what happens to us. One mother said, her young daughter said, I don't want to be a girl because being a girl means that you get raped. And these are the kinds of things that she was hearing. And on the male side, a lot of trans identities are being driven by autogynephilia and fetishes that have been developed from early exposure to pornography. So if you subtracted pornography, a decent percentage of the transgender movement would simply collapse.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Again, if you're just joining us, you can get the details here. We don't have time to go through. There's so many just enlightening things in this book. All right, go to thebridgehead.ca, How We Got Here, and it'll just take you step by step from the sexual revolution to where we are at right now, and then we got to think about, well, how do we change things, right? Any thoughts on this? I know you've already touched on it here, because I think a big part of it is our education system, our politics as well, is changing things. But so how do we swing the pendulum back? I mean, part of me just looks at our education system and says, somehow we've got to invade our education system. We've got to get godly teachers in there, whether that's elementary school, high school, or into our universities, probably especially in our universities, who are producing our teachers for the other levels. that needs to change. We need to get people in there who are bringing godly influence.
So there's a couple of different ways to look at this, right? Of course, there's political action, which is what you're referring to, which is change from the top down. And I don't think that we can count on that kind of change happening anytime soon, because
Right.
as of right now, the sort of consensus of the sexual revolution at the very top encompasses all major political parties. And so in the book, what I try to do is step by step, my first chapter's on the sexual revolution, my second chapter's on the education system and how that was infiltrated. And I talk about practical things that the ordinary Christian reading my book can do to inoculate themselves and their families from this. And so on education, I think that for teachers who would like to go and teach in the public school, that's phenomenal. Look, LGBT activists are deciding to go and become teachers because they want to pass on their worldview. And so for Christians who want to treat the public school system as a mission field, that's phenomenal. But for the average Christian parent, your kid should not be going to public school, full stop. You should be educating your child. If you can't, sending them to a Christian school, make the necessary sacrifices to find a way to educate them with good, pure, wholesome values rather than the values of the sexual revolution. And then I spend an entire chapter. The final chapter is kind of like, what do tactics of resistance look like in a hostile and anti-Christian culture? And this means we need to build thick Christian communities. We need to build communities that are a haven for people in a society that is becoming increasingly anti-Christian, and I believe will get worse before or if it gets better. And so we need to look at the communities we have. We need to invest in them enormously in every imaginable aspect. And then those communities need to be practicing the fundamental Christian command to love their neighbor. And that's where things like the pro-life movement come into play. What does it mean to live as a Christian in a culture that kills its children? It means looking at the legacy of the very early church. It means standing up for those who need our help the most. It means rescuing children who are scheduled to be killed in Canadian clinics. It means helping the mothers who don't have the assistance that they need, because the sexual revolution means an increasing number of children are conceived outside of wedlock. And so there's the internal strategy of building thick Christian communities where we can inculcate.
Well, I got to jump in there because of the clock running here. We real quick, any thoughts on should kids have cell phones?
Kids should absolutely not have a smartphone. I don't have an opinion on whether kids should have cell phones where they just call people and text them. They should absolutely not have access to the internet. If they do receive a device capable of the internet, it must have strict oversight, strict controls. The price you may pay if this is not the case is being manifested in every Christian community across this country.
Our guest today, Jonathon Van Maren, and check it out at the bridgehead.ca. His book is called How We Got Here. It should be in your library. Thanks for watching.